All right, everyone, welcome back to Family Matters. We're heading back to New Zealand shores. You'll know that over recent weeks we've travelled the world in many ways, but we're turning back to a New Zealand conversation, one that does have a political and international aspect, but it's actually something which is popping up in conversation more and more, and in my view, and we'll be discussing this with our guest, has some divisive elements which does impact families. So we're talking I think a fascinating topic. So I'm pleased to introduce my guest today, hopefully familiar to some of you. It's Dr. Sheree Trotter, amongst many hats that she wears. She's a director and founder, I believe, of the Indigenous Embassy Jerusalem. She has a PhD from Auckland University in history, and you were, Sheree, a co-founder of the Holocaust and Anti-Semitism Foundation, amongst many claims to fame.
Yes, that's right. The Holocaust and Anti-Semitism Foundation, we founded in 2012. That's my husband and I, and it's based on the work of interviews with Holocaust survivors. And we've interviewed over 70 Holocaust survivors and created exhibitions from those stories. And we've toured it around the country in museums and in community spaces. And in fact, we've just had an exhibition in the little town of Wellsford in a church hall. And that was a really great opportunity to bring it into the small towns.
Oh, look, I think it's amazing. I've seen some of, obviously, your interviews, the stories being shared, and that wonderful, although it's another way of saying also quite terrible photography. The photographs are amazing, but, you know, the image and the horror they're invoking from what occurred during the Holocaust. So maybe the better word's profound, but I just think it's important and great what you and your husband have led there. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Simon. And it really is important that we keep telling these stories because, unfortunately, the history is being lost. And, a lot of people are quite ignorant about the Holocaust and what happened and, the genocide of the Jewish people, and even knowing simple information like the fact that 6 million Jews were murdered during that time. So it's very important that we keep these stories alive, I think.
It is. I've forgotten the exact percentage, but they did a survey recently, I think, which showed actually, was it almost 50%, or it was some worrying number to me of young people who actually didn't know what the Holocaust was. And you're going, how could be probably one of the most awful moments of the 20th century, which is really not that far away in terms of history, is being forgotten already.
That's right, and we still have Holocaust survivors amongst us. The chair of our board, Bob Nariev, who many of our viewers will know about, he still goes out and tells his story, and he actually came up to Wellsford for an opening event we had for the exhibition, and a really lovely thing happened. There was a young woman, a student in the audience who had done a project on Bob Nariev, so she went up to him afterwards and introduced herself, and it was a really lovely moment.
Bob, I mean, you know it, but Bob's amazing. I did a podcast with him years ago, and again, profound. I said there's something so horrible, and that word doesn't even do justice of what he and so many went through. And yet the strength, the courage, actually, to be able to share those stories. And if I might, you're part of that. The fact that you're able to allow these stories to be told and shown is again, it's a gift. And we're going to be touching on some of that today, because we will touch on the question of Israel. But before we get to that and these political discussions, for people go, what are we going to talk about? Something called settler colonialism, amongst many things. But tell us what this Indigenous Embassy Jerusalem is that you are part of.
Well, the Indigenous Embassy Jerusalem opened a year ago in February at the beginning of last year, and it came out of the work that we had established here in New Zealand called the Indigenous Coalition for Israel, which I co-founded with Alfred Naro, who many of your viewers will know, of course, and we set that up as a platform for Indigenous peoples like ourselves to show our support for Israel, to be able to publicly advocate, bring a balance to the dominant narrative in the media, which paints Jews as foreign colonizers in their ancestral land, and this idea that they've come and dispossessed the Indigenous Palestinians of the land. Of course, as a historian, having looked very closely at this history, that whole statement is problematic and most of it's untrue. And so we felt it was important to have a platform for us to be able to correct the false narratives and to be able to speak in the public square, as it were. And so a year ago, we had this opportunity, and it really came out of this time of war, I think, was part of the motivation for it. I happened to be in Jerusalem in 2023, having done a 2-week scholars in residence at Oxford University with ISGAP, which is the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. And I met with the Deputy Mayor Fleur Hassan Nahum and presented to her this idea of an Indigenous embassy. And of course, she loved that idea. Well, a month later, some of my colleagues, Brad Harmy and Greg Motu, were heading up to Israel for a conference, and it was the 7th of October. It was the 7th of October that they were on that plane heading to Israel. So they got to Dubai, and they had a choice to make, or whether they carry on, because they had the news that this terrible attack had happened. Do they carry on or do they turn back? So some of the group turned back and some of them carried on, and Brad and Greg and others carried on to Israel. And they found themselves having the same conversation with Fleur Hassan Nahum at a Jerusalem prayer breakfast event, and talked about an Indigenous embassy. And Fleur was so excited about this. Well, she was not so much excited, but deeply moved that these Māori from New Zealand had come even as war was breaking out. And she announced right there and there on the program, it's videoed, the intention to establish an Indigenous embassy in Jerusalem. And so our organisation followed up with that conversation, and we moved very quickly towards an opening event, which happened, as I said, over a year ago now.
I think it's quite incredible. Isn't it a great example of how obviously an idea, but a conversation can lead to something? And I think it's, one of the first things I'm wanting to do in this podcast today is obviously make people aware of your wider work, but actually that in this case where indigeneity is becoming quite my term here, Sheree, but it's becoming quite politicised, and certainly in New Zealand and around the world, and very much to do with Israel, that people are aware actually that there are various groups, in this case Indigenous, and more particularly Māori here in New Zealand, are saying, no, we actually want to engage, liaise, and respect, in this case, the Jewish people in their homeland of Israel. But what had caught my attention the other day is you, and it's on your website, you've put out a 2-part series around this concept of settler colonialism. And for viewers and listeners, these are political discussions, but why I wanted to have this chat with Sheree is it's part of this growing narrative in New Zealand, certainly around the world, and I see it, Sheree, as quite divisive, and I don't think that's particularly good, to put it very undiplomatically or simply. But do you mind just talking us through, obviously, this 2-part series that you have written, but even just to pull out, what is this notion of settler colonialism that we are hearing more and more in the narrative here in New Zealand?
Yeah, sure. Well, as I mentioned in my article, I felt I needed to respond, even though kind of reluctantly. Months ago, it was after 7th of October, Tina Ngata, who's a Māori academic, wrote this article attacking our organisation and other Māori Christians who stand with Israel. And she said her title was "Make No Mistake, There is No Indigenous Support for Israel." So in her article, she accuses us of being white supremacists and connected with the far right and these kinds of accusations. And at the time, I decided to put it to one side. I didn't feel it was worth engaging with. But in recent times, I've heard that she's being quoted and she's holding workshops mentioning our organisation. She's being quoted on campuses, and I've seen her quoted elsewhere with these ideas. So I felt it was important to respond, and it's a 2-part response, because what Tina Ngata does is she attacks Māori Christians who stand with Israel. So the first part of my response is about that attack on Māori Christianity, and the second part is to show how this idea of Israel being a settler colonial state is really absurd when you look at the history and the geopolitics. And this is one of the things about settler colonialism. It's very much a politicised view of the world, a politicised view of history, and it just history collapses in the process. It has no regard for history, really, apart from cherry-picking what it wants out of it and imposing this worldview. So it's a totalizing worldview. It's a whole system. I liken it to a religion with its dogma, with its tenets, with its do's and don'ts, with its priests, and with these concepts of the righteous and the unrighteous being, or the good and evil, and that, if you hold to their views, then you are a righteous person. If you don't, then you're an evil person. And because it's very much tied up with the identity politics, it becomes very hateful very quickly. And so people who oppose her views, it's not a conversation about those views. They are then attacked as being racists and as being white supremacists. And Māori like me who don't hold to that ideology, we are labelled colonial Māori. So, she undermines our status as Māori, and, we're not real Māori. There's a lot of us, by the way, who are not real Māori, who are colonial Māori.
Well, you whakapapa to Te Arawa, don't you? Is that right?
Yes, I grew up under the shadow of Mount Nongataha, played along the shores of Lake Rotorua, Lake Rotorua, Lake Tarawera as well. I'm connected to Lake Tarawera and Mount Tarawera, and also in Te Puke, Tapuika is my other iwi. So Tūhaurangi, Ngāti Whakauē and Tapuika are my main iwi. Of course, like most Māori, we have lots of different connections, but those are the main ones.
Because why I quickly raise that for listeners is what you just described around, I think you used the term colonial Maori in this particular case. I saw it in Parliament as well, and it's all linked to that identity politics, that you are or are not part of a group, depending on your political alignment. So I was always struck, Sheree, in Parliament, if you were, and again, I know there's a real political element to this today, but the MPs who bought into a very particular view around the treaty, around colonisation, were Māori. Those of my colleagues on the centre-right were never actually called Māori. They identified as, that their whakapapa, their genealogy, their being Māori was called into question. And I've seen it also in in the sexuality side as well. People who don't hold, let's say, progressive views in the LGBTI space aren't actually seen as being truly in that space. And you're going, well, hold on. We are who we are. We might have different views. That doesn't remove us from them. But this is the insidious nature of identity politics. Who you are appears to me, secondary to what you believe.
Yeah, that's right. And it is a political worldview. And if you cast back on history and look at our tupuna and our forebears, and as I've outlined in the first article, the way that our Māori tupuna embraced Christianity, were the greatest missionaries of Christianity. Kingitanga movement upholds Christianity. Your listeners might not be aware, but even today, the new monarch is crowned under a Bible. And so many of our Māori movements, if you look at the prophetic movements, the Māori prophetic movements of Ringatu and Iharaira and Paimārire, those movements were really inspired by the Old Testament, so not necessarily Christianity, but certainly the Bible, and an identification with the Israelites. So there's this the real flattening of history, and in my mind, it's a dishonouring of our tupuna, and it's robbing us of agency, because this is what the system does. It's a binary worldview. There's only two positions and nothing in between, and there's no nuance to it. And as we've already said, it is very divisive.
Well, it's a big part. I mean, Christianity is here, and as you say, and you understand it better than me, both in experience but also through your PhD. You've studied these things, that it was embraced freely and actually continues to inspire a lot of people today. But I assume those who push this settler colonial concept, it's probably linked to this decolonization stuff as well, which is ultimately it's an imposition from outside and therefore has to be removed. Or am I being too simplistic?
No, that kind of sums it up simply, which is colonial Christianity. It's Western centric. These are the charges that are made of Christianity and the way that Christianity is used as a tool of colonization. Now, there's always a germ of truth in the ideology, and I must acknowledge that. And yes, Christianity was used in part to support the colonizing project, but that's not the whole story. And I guess that's the point I want to make, that it wasn't all bad, and the fact that our people embraced it and chose it as a better way and had their lives remarkably and practices remarkably changed, giving up tribal warfare, giving up the practices like cannibalism. And my detractors will cringe that I'm saying this about our people, and because it is our people, but this is what our people chose back then. But yes, Christianity was employed in the process of colonization. For example, here, colonization was viewed as a civilizing mission. And so in that way, there was this merging of the two things. But I think, we need to get beyond this binary way of seeing and having this conversation, because it doesn't lead to answers, it doesn't lead to change. And, some of the things I would point out, that Christianity itself, even though it came via the British and, the French as well, brought the missionaries here in various denominations, it came via the West. The religion itself is not owned by the West. And if you look at the world today, Christianity is dying in the West, and it is strong in non-Western countries, Africa, Asia, South America. That's where Christianity today is strong. So I guess it's, this universal element at play. It came here via the West, but our people, Indigenous people, embraced it. And Christianity itself is... you can say it's a neutral thing. I don't know if that's the right word for it, but I think you get my point, that it's not owned by the West, even though the West was dominant there for centuries, and I acknowledge it was used for harm. And I think it's important, as we have these conversations, that we can be honest and acknowledge the harms, because we won't move forward if we don't look back and think, yes, well, that was wrong, and we don't want to do that again.
What struck me in some of the discussion here is, as you say, I'm just trying to think of the right words to phrase it, because I see a lot of people, it doesn't matter if they're Māori, Pākehā, Chinese, Russian, it doesn't matter. People freely choose today to be Christian or not. And yet the settler colonialism idea doesn't seem to be one that's just simply historical. And you'll word this better, because I was inspired by what you wrote, that those who push this narrative aren't referencing a particular moment in time. So we know historically that colonizers from, primarily the United Kingdom came here to New Zealand, a couple of 100 years ago. Those pushing this settler colonial narrative, though, are saying that it's ongoing. It's actually a structural thing, and hence they need to destroy it. But I just thought the way you articulated it was certainly much better than I've just paraphrased. Do you mind just explaining that a little bit more?
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. Patrick Wolfe is the theorist who said that settler colonialism is not an event, it's a structure. And this is why I think it's so dangerous, because what they're trying to do today is dismantle all of the structures of Western society, is what they call it, Western society, which is, essentially it's the society we live in. And so they talk about the colonial economy, colonial environmentalism, colonial science, rather, colonial Christianity, all of these structures, the universities, Western-centric universities, all of these structures, in their view, need to be dismantled. And the question is, what are we replacing it with? And why do we need to dismantle everything? Or should we just work towards improving what we have? Because I think anyone who studied history will realise that in the last few decades, 100 years, couple of 100 years, democracy has proved to be a very stable form of government, and the best, I think, that we've achieved so far in world history. And I guess this is another element to keep in mind, is that it's a narrow view that looks very narrowly at history, and colonisation goes back thousands of years. But, there's this hyper-focus with settler colonialism on Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the US, these colonisation that's come from Britain mainly, others as well, and has impacted the Indigenous people. And again, I think we should acknowledge it has impacted Indigenous people adversely, and that needs to be faced and dealt with. But I don't think settler colonialism has the answers for us. I think it's destructive, and we should understand it, recognise it, talk about it, and find a better way.
It almost, and this is my thought, and again, correct me on this, it's almost misusing history, and I might go as far to say, Sheree, misusing what was harmful to ancestors prior to generate, a destructive reality now. So yes, bad things did happen when settlers came to the likes of New Zealand, Australia, any country. But in a way to misuse that moment of history and say that it's still here right now, acting in the same way is, well, not only historically wrong, but it also just seems to dishonour the past. I've probably not articulated that very well.
No, I think you're right. I think you've described it well. It is the politicisation of history, and it's not the way historians like to work. We like to look at what's happened, look at the evidence, try and understand the past from the point of view of those historical figures in the past. But this is very much a politicised perspective that comes with a theory and then interprets the past based on that theory. And the theory really comes out of Foucault. The whole notion of power relationships is at the core of society, and we need to interrogate those power relationships. And this is where this binary concept comes from, of the oppressor and the oppressed, and the powerful and the powerless, and everything is broken down into this simplistic model. Whereas what we know from history is that there were good and bad on all sides. There were powerful, and there's power relationships within Māori culture. There were power relationships, and there still are today. And yet settler colonialism focuses on what this one relationship of the settler, government, and all the structures that have come in this ongoing colonisation. And there's a real kind of twisting of vocab and words like genocide, which initially talked about the intentional murder of groups of people. The term has become so downplayed is not the right word, but diminished, to call anything genocide today that impinges on our culture, on our cultural practices. Well, that's a type of genocide. And so this is how we get this idea of an ongoing colonisation.
And again, it's one of the reasons why bringing this discussion to listeners is because it's happening right around us here in New Zealand. Then we should actually turn to Israel and how it's playing out there. But it's a very destructive mindset, as you say, very binary, very black and white, almost literally and figuratively. But it's pitting people against one another. And I might suggest too that, putting it bluntly, I don't see people as settlers here anymore in that colonial fashion, but so much of what we as a country and our generations have worked together is now being attacked by these academics and others. So it's our democratic systems. The parliament, for example, is just a settler or a colonial parliament. There's no democratic legitimacy. The police are just colonial. Everything's put into this framework and therefore illegitimate. And to someone like myself, I go, that's not particularly useful in itself. Every structure has its flaws, not saying it's perfect, but actually, let's say this Western democratic system can be for anyone it might have evolved in the West, but it's drawn its inspiration from a number of cultures. But it's working by and large, and it's better than a lot of systems. And yet these people are trying to undermine it. And you touched as well earlier, what are we replacing it with? Even if we were to accept the premise that our structures in society need to be radically changed, I don't, by the way, but even if we accepted our argument, there doesn't seem to be a clear view of what we're going to replace it with.
Yeah, well, I think we're seeing this and seeing it play out with the Green Party at the moment, who want to defund the police and things like this. I mean, it's out of the playbook in America of the movements over there. But I guess, one of the things about attacking Western civilization and culture is that the things that have provided us stability in Western culture is the Judeo-Christian foundation, so that there was a set of standards by which we all lived and understood as being the standards. Do not murder, do not kill, do not steal. The Ten Commandments were commonly understood in past generations, and it gave society a sense of stability. Even if you didn't believe it yourself, even if you weren't a Christian or didn't hold to the Bible, it gave us a set of values that were commonly understood as being the right values by which to live. But of course, all of that is attacked and challenged today by settler colonial ideology and other ideologies. I mean, it's a close relationship to critical theory. Critical theory is more social sciences, settler colonial is more humanities, but they're all based on similar ideas, Foucault being, one of the key thinkers across all of these. So in a sense, that is what's under attack. And when you dig into some of their words, you'll see words like patriarchy. Patriarchy is one of the problems, and replacing it with matriarchy and these kinds of ideas. So a lot of these things that are associated actually with what has been the foundation of Western society for hundreds of years, which is a Judeo-Christian framework, that is under attack. And of course we see that with gender ideology as well, and all of these things that I guess the progressive left are pushing. That's what they're attacking, is the Judeo-Christian foundations of society.
Just my take on it, because I totally agree with you. What I see is irony and hypocrisy, though, from those who use these critical theory tools or language. As you say, they attack patriarchy, they attack hierarchy, they attack power, and yet they want it. And that's the irony in a lot of this. It's actually, at its heart, not an attempt to actually bring in, well, they believe in new utopia, but actually they want that power. And we've seen it, be it in New Zealand or around the world, that if certain institutions or structures, and I'm thinking in academia, are taken over by these groups, all that changes is who holds the power. A lot of the same human instincts come through, which, if I might, as you were saying earlier, the Judeo-Christian worldview moderates a lot of the excesses of our humanity. The Ten Commandments are quite profound, and when followed actually leads to enormous stability. So we can certainly see that the danger in this discussion that's happening here in New Zealand and how it's problematic. But we started around Israel, and again with this two-part article and YouTube series that you've done, you focus a lot into, obviously, Israel. And a big part of the narrative we keep hearing here is that the Jewish people are settlers or colonists, which is absurd on every level. So I just tease that out. I mean, it's almost ridiculous, Sheree, that we have to even be discussing this. But the narrative being pushed out there is just so false that it's mind-boggling. You can hear me hesitate. I just find it mind-boggling. So just tease out how they're trying to apply this concept into the Levant.
Yeah, and it beggars belief, for sure. Well, it requires great ignorance of history, I think, to be able to push this view, because as we know, there's been a continuous Jewish presence in the land for more than well over 3,000 years. And Israel is the land within which the Jewish culture, language, literature developed. And these are the markers of an Indigenous people, is their connection to land. You know, if you look at Jewish practices, their festivals, their religion, their laws, it's all very much based in the land and the plants of the land and the seasons of the land. You know, the fact that you have coming up, we have Pesach or Passover, which is in their springtime, and they will have the fruits of the land in that festival. Likewise, later when they celebrate their other festivals, it's connected to the land. And even when they were expelled from their land, they still pray 3 times a day facing towards Jerusalem, the ones who are religious. They still say every year at Passover, next year in Jerusalem. You know, the Jerusalem is mentioned so many times in the Bible, not mentioned once in the Quran. There are all these facets that just affirm the truth that Jews are indigenous to the land, and also DNA evidence and archaeology. You go to the land and it's everywhere. It's in the dirt. It's in the dust. Their history is in the dust. You can literally drag it out of the dirt and find a coin that's 2,000 years old showing Jewish connection to the land. So if you look at the history, it's absurd. But they only go back to 1948, these theorists. You know, they seem to think that there was no history before that. And they push this idea of Jews being foreign colonizers coming into the land. Well, that whole concept, you know, of settler colonialism is the notion that you have a power base, a metropole that sets out to settle in a foreigner's land where there are already Indigenous people. So that's what happened here in New Zealand, of course, that the British came, no prior contact with the land, or, you know, apart from their first initial forays into the land. But they were strangers in the land, is my point. Whereas with the Jews coming back to their land, they were coming back to their ancestral land. Besides the fact that there'd always been a Jewish presence there, even though the majority had been expelled, there was always a small presence there in the land. And for us as Māori, that's the concept of ahika, of keeping the fires burning by having a presence in the land. So under settler colonialism, you know, where is the metropole? Where is the power that's sending Jews to the land? Well, there isn't one. And Jews came back largely because of persecution and because of anti-Semitism, and particularly in the 19th century in Russia, you know, when persecution broke out, about 3 million Jews left Russia. Many went to America, and some of those came back to the land, which at that time was part of the Ottoman Empire. And by the way, it wasn't a state, it wasn't a country, it was an administrative district, a small corner of the Ottoman Empire that was an administrative district run by Syria at the time. And it had no clearly defined borders. But this was the land, and it was a neglected, forgotten corner of the Ottoman Empire, by the way. And so this was the land that the Jewish people started coming back to. And it was backbreaking work, you know, to turn these swamps and malaria and all of these kinds of challenges, to turn it into productive land. And it was as they did that the Arab immigration really increased from the neighbouring Arab countries. So, you know, the settler colonial model really doesn't work when it's applied to Israel.
It just doesn't, for all the reason you mention. I mean, it's just, yeah. Again, I just find myself sort of dumbfounded by, I mean, people are welcome to have, if you will, different political perspectives on what's happening in Israel and Gaza, but this constant reference to, as I say, settler colonialism, that the Jewish people are foreign, it just boggles my mind. And suppose one question is, you say, the concept of ahika, we've got, you'd think, and I might get this wrong, but you would think those who are Indigenous here in New Zealand, who have been at times dispossessed from their land, would understand much more clearly what the Jewish community has gone through. And yet we have a number, not all, of course, you've set up the Indigenous embassy, but you have some of the loudest voices against the Jewish people or against Israel are the ones coming who should know better. They should know what it's like to be dispossessed, and yet they are on the other side. And it confuses me, and I don't understand how we've ended up in that situation.
Well, the older generation of Māori certainly understand the Jewish history and connection to the land, but it's this new generation, and it has developed over decades. It's connected with the anti-apartheid movement that, began here late 70s, early 80s, where young Māori activists connected with these international movements, the Black consciousness movement in the States. These movements were very much aligned with the Marxist left, I guess you could say, Cuba, Fidel Castro, and Yasser Arafat. And I found it quite informative when Willie Jackson, at the end of 2023, I think it was, there had been a protest down at Parliament for Israel, and Destiny Church were there. And Willie Jackson inside the House said that those people do not represent Māori. Māori are pro-Palestinian, always have been, always will be. Our heroes are Fidel Castro, Yasser Arafat, and Nelson Mandela. And so what he was referencing there was that Arab-Soviet alliance, which has developed not just here in New Zealand, but globally. It has developed since the 1960s, a very anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian movement, and done so very successfully. So that activist movement has long whakapapa here in New Zealand, and we had the likes of Donna Awatere, who connected with Fidel Castro and who based her ideas for Māori sovereignty on the Palestinian Liberation Front, which is a terrorist organisation. But in her book, Māori Sovereignty, she identifies the enemies based on the Palestinian Liberation Front pamphlet, which identified Israel, world imperialism, the British, and Arab reaction as the enemy. She translated that to the New Zealand context and identified as enemies Pākehā New Zealand, Christianity, colonial Māori, and I think it was British imperialism. So I might not have that completely correct, but it just shows that there was this genealogy, this whakapapa of these ideas that circulated within Māori circles. Very much the Marxist stream came through very clearly in that, and that connection with Arab. And that Arab Marxist stream is quite well developed and well understood. And there's a wonderful scholar who's written about it called Isabella Tabarovsky, who I had the pleasure of meeting in Oxford. And she grew up in the Soviet Union. And people who grew up in the Soviet Union, they look at what's happening today and it feels very familiar to them. And even in New Zealand, what they're seeing happening in New Zealand reminds them of the Soviet Union. So there has been this stream which has become dominant in academia, in Māori academia, so that really has influenced media, Māori media, and politics. And so the activist stream here has become very strong.
I pointed it out a few times in my parliamentary days, the great irony of these activists, be they MPs or outside of Parliament, who rage against colonialism as they perceive it today, against colonial powers and so forth, seem to me very happy to have been colonised by these academic ideas from the likes of Marx and Engels, Castro, Foucault, who we've mentioned several times. I've always found that a bit of an irony to me, that they are raging against all that they perceive to be settler colonialism, Christianity, democratic institutions, rule of law, you name it, but very, very happy to be colonised by cultural Marxist thinking. It's like, oh, honest, it sort of does my head in. Hey, Sheree, if people want to engage more and understand, obviously, the work that you lead, particularly through the Indigenous Embassy Jerusalem, but to engage into that two-part series that I keep referencing, where do people go and find that information?
It's on the indigenousembassy.org website, and we have a YouTube channel as well for the videos. So that's indigenousembassy.org.
Brilliant. Well, I encourage people to go and have a look. It was Sheree who had actually sent me the links originally, and I was quite taken by not just the concepts, but just how well they were expressed, hence wanting to bring you on to chat today. So Sheree, look, thank you so much again for the leadership you and the wider family are involved with, and thanks for your time here today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.